welcome to the final day of the hearing. Just to let people know that we have received overnight or from yesterday afternoon, we've received responses from Nicole McKay and Dika in response to some questions and clarifications that arose yesterday at the hearing. And we've also received a copy of the proponent's Part B submission and the final version of the project documentation. So that's what we've received so far. There's no other preliminary matters from the committee. I was just checking from the proponent if there was anything before you got started.
No, thank you.
Okay. I'm just checking with any other parties online. Nope. Okay. All right. Over to you. I assume Mr. O'Farrell, you'll be leading.
Yes, please. Member McMillan and Mr. Forrester will help me along the way.
Okay, no problem.
I thought perhaps if we screen shared the Part C submission, because we'd be surprised if the committee's had the chance to do other than answer that. So
no, we haven't. We have not had the opportunity to review it yet. So yeah, no, that would be useful. Thank you.
So what we thought is if we just scroll through the Part C, it's not particularly long, and then the final day documents just point out any other modifications that have been made to that. But if the committee has any questions on the way, by all means, jump in at any point. So the Part C submission there is on the screen and prepared in response to your directions, and it just raises matters by way of reply for the last couple of days and in response to your questions. So then turn to the reply. Perhaps I won't even bother with 2 through to 5. It really just outlines what we've done by way of reply. And then across to the next page, at the top of page 2, common issues, and the common issues that you identified in document 6. A number of the submitters raised issues in relation to some of those matters in their submissions. And that last line in the italics about that the previous committee and this committee will not be reventilating those issues as part of this process. At paragraph 8 there, we just invite the committee to proceed in the manner consistent with that previous packages in respect of each of these issues. And so for those reasons, we haven't gone back into the detail of those matters again, and I'll reply to submissions as they were raised the last few days. We did observe along the way the last couple of days, there's quite a lot of submissions made, comments made, but many of them under the banner of views expressed without an evidence base. And our client welcomes evidence-based and substantiated submissions that have contributed to the improvement of the outcomes of the overall assessment and to the environmental improvements to the floodplains. But respectfully, a number of the submitters express views that are properly within the domain of expert knowledge, and including hydrology, ecology, biodiversity, water management and land management, without any reference to a basis in evidence relevant to the projects. We don't seek to take away from the individual views of submitters or their contributions to this process, but their views come with caveat that they're not being profited on the basis of an expert knowledge. And what we do say there is that we haven't responded to the raft of individual comments in that nature in the last few days, but we just invite the committee to be discerning in acknowledging personal views whilst preferring the conclusions of the independent expert witnesses who have provided in our submission reliable evidence informed by comprehensive specialist assessments, and they've undertaken themselves, or they've adopted it within their specialised knowledge, experience and expertise. Then views that were attributed to others we resisted the temptation to interrupt. I think at one point we interrupted one of the submitters on a particular topic, but you will have heard along the way several submissions were making references to comments or attributing views to other people that either aren't a submitter or aren't here. And so naturally we'd say that there's very little that can be by way of weight or significance that should be given to such comments by the committee. But for example, some submitters purported to speak for others, including traditional owners, in the course of their submissions, and our client doesn't endorse that approach in the absence of express authority to do so, and save for noting that when this was done, it doesn't speak. We don't seek to reply to those views or experiences attributed by some submitters to unnamed others and also to named others, because it's truly in the nature of hearsay, which is always a very dangerous evidence base, but it's not even being put forward as evidence. It was just in the manner of a submission. Then we address particular submissions. Submission number 15 from Ms. Peace, the table document 74, included a number of matters that were not included in her submission during the exhibition of the environment report, or which were not put to any of the witnesses. But that said, the issues that the LNW has identified as being raised in 74 have largely been addressed in the evidence and the submissions. In particular, we observed a list of matters rhetorically posed at page 25 of document 74. They're all specifically addressed in the evidence. We also note that throughout table document 74, and there's various references to publications, and when you go to those publications, they clearly support the need for action to restore floodplains and wetlands. There's reference to Reedy Lagoon in document 74, which has received environmental water as part of the TLM Gunbower project. And that document 74, the proposition that since environmental water has come into play, Reedy Lagoon rarely dries out and its biodiversity is declining. That's inconsistent with what has been identified by the ecologists in monitoring, evaluation and reporting. At paragraph 18, we note that the 25 vegetation monitoring reporting concludes environmental water is substantially improving Reedy Lagoon to an extent greater than unregulated flooding. And in that extract, which I might just read, that the wetlands exceeded the richness targets 9 times in 19 years of autumn surveys, often following e-water delivery, and lists those years. In the years following both extensive unregulated flooding and when drying during the Millennium Drought in 08, the number of compliant wetlands was very low. The wetlands have met the 50% health target for cover in 12 of 19 years, often following inundation with e-water. The wetlands achieved the 50% health target for presence of threatened species in 12 of 19 monitoring years, commonly following e-water delivery, and in the same years that the richness and cover targets were met. When the wetlands were dry, or mostly dry, such as in 08 and 21, or following large unregulated flow events 12, 17, 23, 24, fewer threatened species were recorded and the target was not achieved. And in 7 of the 9 years that the wetlands have been collectively assessed as healthy, autumn surveys followed e-water delivery to some or all of the sites. Social and economic effects weren't raised in Ms. Peace's submission during the exhibition period, and they weren't identified as uncertain is relevant to the Minister's decision in respect of either project, but notwithstanding, they are assessed in Specialist Assessment L and are subject to appropriate EDS consistent with previous packages. In respect of the reference to lack of community consultation, we note that the consultation is detailed throughout the package. We also note that the particular submitter was offered membership of the Gunbower Stakeholder Advisory Group, but that offer was declined. And it should also be noted that LNW and the North Central CMA have used their best endeavours to respond to many requests for information and assistance that have been made by Ms. Peace over a long period of time. Submission 16 was from the Central Murray Environmental Floodplain Group Incorporated and Gunbarra District Land Care Incorporated. Ms. Dickens made that submission. She spoke to document 79, which includes various matters listed A through to E. And we don't address those aspects of the submitter's submissions relating to SIDLAM as being outside the scope of the considerations. And we similarly don't address her submission, which has attribution of views to the Barapa people. On the topic of hydrology, under the heading Inundation in Natural Floods Compared with Environmental Watering, slide 79 of that presentation in document 79 asserts differences between natural floods and environmental watering. That is inundation by operation of the projects, but no basis was put forward for these assertions, and the differences referred to are not borne out in the evidence. The introductory presentations that were made by our client and the CMA addressed the basis on which infrastructure would be operated in high flow events. To recall the question from member Bates, Ms. Dickens identified her understanding that project infrastructure would represent obstacles to flow, including the specific reference to regulators and drop structures, but that's inconsistent with the whole conception of the projects having been proposed, having been designed in order that infrastructure does not pose obstacles to flow. But that's been explained in the environment report, in the presentations provided to you, and the evidence of both Mr. Tate and Dr. Treadwell. This topic of current versus altered in response to a question from you, Member Elliott, Ms. Dickens referred to wetting and drying periods over generations with several thousands of years of development of forests. Forest and forest vegetation have evolved over long dry periods and flood periods. That appears to reflect the submission that was made during exhibition of the environment report, which refers to increasing the frequency of inundations on the apparent understanding that the Gunbarra project would increase flooding as compared to natural pre-regulation conditions rather than as compared with existing regulating conditions. And that submission it did so on the basis of reference to records of flood years since 1867, as set out in a table at page 6 of that submission. And then at page 7, the submission said the chart shows the consistency in flood level height at Echuca and megalitres per day flowing through Torrumbra Weir, and natural flood frequency and flood levels that would have entered Gunbarra Forest from 1889 to 2022 is consistent. Therefore, construction of Torrumbra Weir and the Hume Dam could be irrelevant in the argument that these structures have reduced the frequency of natural floods in the Murray River. We think it's important to observe first that sources recording flooding do not necessarily identify particular inundation of floodplains and wetlands. For example, submission 16 suggests there's 17 years prior to 1906 with no flooding, 10 years prior to 1916 with no flooding, and 17 years prior to 1934 with no flooding. But that can be compared with historical gauge data collected from 1895, which show how even in years which were not recorded as associated with flooding, in the records relied upon by submission 16, flow exceeded 30,000 megalitres a day at Torrumbra and therefore would have inundated the project areas. And we've noted there the source for that the inflows to the forest commence when the flow at Torrumbra exceeds 16 to 17,000 megalitres a day and increase substantially above that 30,000 figure. And then if one looks through the table, we've put that all together into this table, greater than 30,000 at Torrumbra, and then the event referred to in submission 16 you can see the stark contrast. And just that when one goes through the historical records, the assertions are made in submission 16 are just not borne out by the historical record. As can be seen, paragraph 33 now, the project's floodplains would have received flood flow events in 35 of the 40 years referred to above, including, but not only, in the 4 and 40 years identified in submission 16 as involving a flood. The gauge flows over the period demonstrate that floodplains would have received flood flows in up to 9 in 10 years, notwithstanding that the above years include the Federation drought, increased river regulation, including construction of river locks from 1913, diversions exceeding 2,500 gigalitres per year by 1925, government storages exceeding 2,500 gigalitres by 1925 and approaching 5,000 gigalitres by 1939. And it's unsurprising that historical records from times when inundation of floodplains was routine do not record flooding in years the floodplains were inundated. Gauge flows also demonstrate the inaccuracy of submission 16 statement that flood levels would have entered Gunbarra Forest from 1889 to 2022 is consistent. If one compares the first decade of gauge data with the most recent decade, and you can see that exercise is done in the table there, even with significant overbank events of 2016 and 22, the 30,000 megalitres a day flow threshold was reached in only 3 of the most recent 10 years. Looking back another 10 years to the period 2006 to 2015, flow exceeded 30,000 at Turrumbary in only 2010, 11 and 12, again in the context of significant flow events. Then looking back another 10 years to the period 96 to 05, flow exceeded 30,000 at Turrumbary only in 96 and 2000. And of course, the project is concerned not just with frequency of inundation, but the equally important factors of duration and extent. And in each respect, the altered hydrology regime of the floodplains and the consequences of the altered hydrology regime for the ecology and biodiversity of floodplains and the values they support are matters of incontestable fact. The next topic in the submission was in relation to erosion, and project infrastructure, including infrastructure proposed to be located near the bank of the Murray River, has been designed and sited having regard to erosion risk. Infrastructure will be designed to reduce the likelihood of undercutting and collapse of structures as a result of riverbank failure through implementation of EDS GS5. And the level of certainty with the mitigation strategy being effective is considered high, given it is standard practice for site-specific geotechnical and riverbank conditions erosion to be considered in design, and the significance of residual adverse effects related to bank instability after implementation of EDS GS1 is considered to be low, as the likelihood of the effect occurring would be rare. Erosion risk would also be managed during construction in accordance with EDS GS2 and during operation through ongoing monitoring, evaluation and reporting in accordance with EDS GS3. And again, the level of certainty of the mitigation strategies being effective, considered high, and ultimately the asset owner would be responsible for any management and rectification measures that would need to be employed to ensure structural integrity of the infrastructure. A response then to the inundation part of that submission, we submit that the committee respectfully should prefer the detailed expert assessment presented in the environment report and expert evidence regarding the ecological condition of the project areas as compared to assertions raised in submissions without reference to any evidence base. A number of submitters openly acknowledged the ecological decline of the floodplain. This was also raised in consultation, and the stakeholder advisory group for Gunbower agreed that the health of the forest is declining, and that was recorded at the advisory group meeting in April, as early as April 2021. The next submission was from the Friends of the Koala Incorporated. Mr. Schinkel made the oral submissions, and in reply, we note that we don't accept that the koala has not been given adequate consideration in the environmental report. Mr. Holmes gave specific evidence in respect of the survey efforts and consideration of arboreal mammals other than identified threatened species. Mr. Schinkel raised the SIAC listing of the koala in New South Wales as a matter relevant to the projects. The only elements of the projects that extend into New South Wales are pipes associated with pump stations and drop structures below the top of the bank of the Murray River. And the impacts of that infrastructure has been assessed, and there's no potential impact to the koala or potential koala habitat. The decision of the Commonwealth Minister in relation to the VREP project, that was based on conclusions regarding unacceptable impacts to a Ramsar site somewhere else that was caused by reclamation of the seabed, construction of a wharf and dredging. Of course, none of those things are before you or in contemplation here. And the Commonwealth Minister concluded would have been permanent and irreversible impacts on the character and values of that Ramsar site. It had nothing to do with trees or any terrestrial flora or fauna. And to the extent that it's even remotely relevant, that project has been recut and put in a different form. So it was just that particular type of project was the one that decision related to. So we just say that it doesn't really raise to the height of having any relevance to this case. But more importantly, did it have anything to do with a project conceived and delivered for the purpose of improving the Ramsar site, and that seemed to have likely been lost on that submitter, that this is a project about improving a Ramsar site. So restoration of wetlands is entirely consistent with the Ramsar Convention. Mr. Schinkel submitted that the table document 20 has not been the subject of auditing for ground truth, nor has been assessed against the statement of reasons applied for under the EPBC Act in respect to the Hutter Lakes North project. Immediate reaction to that is, well, why would it need to be? But in any event, table document 20 is not presented as an audit report. It's an indication of avoidance and minimisation efforts as part of the post-approval detailed design and construction phase. As proposed for this project, construction activities at Hatter Lakes North will be subject to compliance reporting and auditing by independent environmental auditor. The Hatter Lakes North EPBC approval reasons are of limited relevance to you. And notably, they identify a maximum clearing of about 19 hectares of native veg, being the extent approved in the EES Central Incorporated Document and EMF, requirements of the Incorporated Document and EMF for avoidance and minimisation of impacts, and the Commonwealth Minister's conclusion that there would be no residual impact on Regent Parrot in regard to the proposed mitigation measures other than the hollow replacement plan by the Victorian Minister. The hollow replacement plan was not justified for Corbyn's long-eared bat, notwithstanding the Victorian Minister's recommendation, and bird flu protocols and compliance are not within the scope of your task, respectfully. Turning then to Ms McKay's submission, we'd submit that, that there were loose parts of the submission that you could say, you might be able to say related to the projects. Ms McKay did accept that altered hydrology is resulting in insufficient inundation of the floodplains and that action should be taken. Ultimately, she supports constraints, relaxation. Again, not before you. It's just a different thesis that Ms McKay has. But Ms McKay said that algae and blackwater don't occur prior to the 1990s. That caused some surprise in our camp that was being suggested, and a simple reference to the historical record disagrees with that assertion that was made. We've extracted there a timeline of documented anoxic blackwater events in the Southern Basin, and whilst LMW agrees that more widespread blackwater events have been recorded in more recent years, noting that they have followed the lengthy period of infrequent and short flooding in the latter 20th and early 21st century, in a demonstration of evidence of Dr. Treadwell regarding the impact of lengthy periods without sufficient inundation that allows the accumulation of organic material on the floodplains. Ms. McKay described her understanding of the projects as involving putting up barriers in the floodplain, similar submission and similar response to one of the earlier submissions. That's not what this project seeks to do, but also submitted that the risk of inundation of private land does not seem to have been looked at enough. Those submissions were made having heard from Ms. McKay, who had said that she hadn't been through all the materials. I think she said she hadn't allocated the time for it or didn't have time, but still continued to make those submissions. But as we've explained previously in this reply submission and demonstrated in the hydraulic modelling and evidence of Mr. Tate and Dr. Treadwell, the projects do not involve barriers to flow. The potential for inundation on private land has been specifically assessed, culminating in the proposed SW4 as relevant to Gunbower. Ms. McKay referred to the maximum extent of A-flux at Benwell, which is entirely contained within public land. She referred to page 50 and table 22 from the Arthur Riley Institute Mallee CMA CDL Fish Management Plan Vinifera floodplain, and in support of submissions regarding fish response to environmental watering and the adequacy of mitigation measures in respect of low DO events. That document was prepared at the time of development of the VMFRP business case. It does not represent or reflect the potential effects of requirements relevant to the Vinifera project, which are assessed as relevant in the ER Central NIA Vinifera report and ministerial assessment of those projects, including EDS SW2, as addressed in detail in Part B submission, and has no relevance to the proposed relevant mitigation measures for the projects. There were some questions, I think, but about fish management plans. The Arthur Riley Institute prepared that fish management plan for Cameron's Creek in 2020. It's addressed at page 37 of Dr. Lefevre's witness statement and his slide 37. It was addressed also in his evidence, and as he explained, the fish management plan was incorporated into the design and management of the upper Gunbower portion of the projects, and management of carp will be incorporated into the pest, plant and animal monitoring and management plan to be developed as part of EDS D3. You've received unequivocal evidence from Mr. Tate and Dr. Treadwell in respect of the potential impacts of the project on surface water values, including within and outside the project areas, and from Dr. Lefevre in respect of aquatic ecology. Mr. McKay, we'd say regretfully, made selective reference to the Commonwealth Minister's reasons in respect of the EPB SIAC approval of the NIA project, but if you recall the particular stanza of that decision or reasons that Mr. McKay read, he stopped short after about a line and a half, whereas if you read the whole paragraph, you can see that he omitted to note the balance of the paragraph where the Minister in that paragraph concluded that with appropriate mitigation, the project's impacts were acceptable. And so we'd submit that his selective reference to the Minister's reasons, for that reason, are really of no assistance to the committee. Perhaps what's of more assistance is him pointing to that paragraph. The entirety of that paragraph we would submit is of assistance to the committee because it illustrates that on a previous occasion, the Minister has said that with appropriate mitigation measures, very similar or identical to what's proposed to be employed here, the project's impacts will be acceptable. Finally, we note the difficulty in reconciling Ms. McKay's concurrent propositions that, sorry, I think I referred to.
No, I think we did hear that.
I'm
No,
sorry.
we did hear that reference. It's okay. We understand who you were referring to.
My apologies, Ms. McKay. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. On I go. We do note the difficulty in reconciling Ms. McKay's concurrent propositions that inundation of floodplains in association with the projects is unacceptable, because water coming off the floodplain will result in unacceptable impacts on the Murray, and also the difficulty reconciling it with the second part of the submission was that something needs to be done to get more water on the floodplains. Turning then to Ms. Lefever's submissions, she identified the benefits of inundation and other matters relevant to alternatives, the status of the projects as SIDLAM supply measures, or financial matters we don't address further. In response to DECA, overall improvement to the biodiversity, DECA recognised the substantial work undertaken by the proponent, including to implement the mitigation hierarchy and minimise environmental impacts of the projects. It identifies that the projects would have an overall improvement to biodiversity and continues to support the projects for their contribution to ecology overall Murray-Darling Basin health. Has concluded that the projects satisfy the tests for the conservation works exemption by demonstrating a clear overall improvement to biodiversity, and submits that the native vegetation offsets are not triggered in this instance. And we've spent a bit of time on this yesterday. We made an invitation to DECA, and we've seen the documents that have come in overnight about this, but the gut point here really is what DECA has said at paragraph 33. Now, the Secretary, of course, is part and parcel of DECA, so this is a statement from DECA that the requirement to secure native vegetation offsets is not triggered in this instance. So with the knowledge of the previous projects and the assessment that's taken place for this project, this is the conclusion that DECA has reached. Now, it's always difficult in this sort of environment where the officers of DECA, I'm sure, are doing their very best, and it's a hard-working group of staff there at DECA. But it would seem that that's the conclusion, but when it's suggested, well, what's the logical extension of that? The logical extension is, well, if offsets aren't triggered, there's no need for the incorporated document to have an offset triggering condition in it. And that's a refinement from the previous project, because at the time of the previous projects, as you've heard, that work hadn't been done. And DECA wasn't in a position to make the conclusion that it has made in paragraph 33. And then you heard the pleas from the department to try and reserve the right of the Secretary. As we said yesterday, we think that puts it too high and really misunderstands the statutory basis upon how we put our case. Now, our case, and we go into this in the next paragraph and following. So I'll just stick with what's in the submission. That position is not consistent with its submission that you should recommend inclusion of the conditions in the incorporated document that requires the Secretary to agree that the native vegetation offsets are not required for the project, on the basis that until the ministerial assessments of the projects has been completed, it's not known whether the conclusion will be that the overall improvement to biodiversity has been demonstrated. Now, it's a bit of a perverse submission that's been put to you. Paragraph 30, that DECA is unequivocally saying that offsets are not triggered here, but seems to be wanting to keep the trigger alive, subject to what the Minister's assessment is. But of course, we're in this process where the Minister has asked you for advice on this project. One of the key players on this topic is DECA. DECA are telling you unequivocally through paragraph 33 that native vegetation offsets are not triggered. So our submission to you is, guided by DECA on this, your recommendation should be to accept that conclusion and submission from DECA. not only because DECA's saying it, but because it's consistent with the submissions we are making to you and the raft of evidence that has been put before you. And you would need to have a good evidence base just not to accept that position. And in our submission, there isn't an evidence base for you not to accept how we're putting it to you. At 76, it seems that DECA's submission is premised on the proposition that VMFRP is relying on the conservation work exemption in clause 52.17, or that it is relying on a comparable test, or we're relying upon an exemption being given by the Secretary of DECA. That's not the case. That misunderstands the case. Effectively, what the case is that we're putting is because the incorporated document becomes the planning scheme, and because of the way it's drafted, it switches off clause 52.17, where that secretarial exemption exists. And so once that's switched off, there's no need for the Secretary to go any further than what has already occurred in paragraph 33. So LMW submits as follows, that you're tasked to advise the Minister in respect of whether an overall improvement to biodiversity has been demonstrated. We invite you to advise the Minister that it has. You've got a very compelling basis for that to occur and make that recommendation, that being what DECA has told you and what DECA has concluded in combination with the raft of materials, submissions, expert evidence that's been before you. At 77.2, you've been tasked to advise the Minister as to whether, in the context of the possible need for native vegetation offsets, the proposed alternative arrangements, that's been the operation of projects to achieve overall improvement to biodiversity in accordance with the proposed EMF and EDS, are acceptable. And again, we invite you to advise the Minister that they are. Now, once the Minister has your report, she'll appropriately consider and reach a conclusion regarding the acceptability of the proposed alternative arrangements. But that's not something that you need to worry about. That's a task that is for the Minister. Your report and the conclusion will inform the Minister's decision making as the planning authority in respect of the draft PSA. And it's in this context that the committee's advice, including whether conditions should be included in the incorporated document, is particularly relevant. LMW submits that on the basis that it's been demonstrated that native vegetation offsets are not required and the proposed alternative arrangements, that is, demonstration of an overall improvement to biodiversity, are acceptable. Respectfully, the committee should advise the Minister that the relevant conditions are not required and should not be incorporated into the incorporated document. So DECA then explained its position being that the decision that native vegetation offsets are not required is dependent on the committee's findings and the Minister's conclusion that the projects will achieve overall improvement to biodiversity. Following that, then the Secretary should decide, consistent with regulation and state policy requirements, whether offsets are required. Now, that doesn't accord with the processes under the Environment Effects Act or the Planning Environment Act. It seeks to, we've said, elevate and safeguard the role of the Secretary as a decision maker in respect of the conservation works exemption, but it really would be to create a fiction or a false artifice that just doesn't exist under what's proposed here. So the Secretary, again, we do understand that within the department there might be some caution about this, but effectively what we're inviting the committee to take on is the task you've been set by the Minister, and to accept that responsibility, hear the submissions that have been put to you, and really in effect relieve the department of its caution by saying, look, you accept what DECA said, you accept what we're putting to you, that once we understand the position that's been stated by DECA in paragraph 33, there's no need for clause 52.17 anymore. We then switch on to what's the best planning control to capture this project. And DECA's told you that offsets aren't required, and so that's why those conditions should be deleted. Now, there are some other things, and we don't seek to be critical of DECA, but it just struck us that some other parts of the submission that came in response to these inquiries and the materials overnight were reaching a bit far into trying to find a justification, but we don't think that with rational planning analysis or environmental analysis that some of these reaches actually take you anywhere. And so at paragraphs 73 and 74 of the hearing submission, DECA said that the relevant conditions should be included because of the need for an enforceable monitoring and reporting framework that includes adaptive management and targeted mitigation measures. But that exists, of course, because the framework's provided in the EMF, which is enforceable both within itself, given the monitoring, compliance and auditing requirements, and also under the extensive enforcement regime that's available under the Planning and Environment Act, which I'm sure that this division of the committee is well aware of, but across the country, the planning, relative to the rest of the country, the Planning and Environment Act has a very broad ability for enforcement, and it's effectively any person can enforce. So it's not limited to DECA or the minister. It relates to pretty much any person. So it is a very broad and all-encompassing enforcement regime that these documents would sit within. So we'd submit that first reach or justification for the conditions just doesn't go anywhere, because the committee can very safely proceed on the basis that these provisions will sit comfortably in a enforceable monitoring and reporting framework that includes adaptive management and targeted mitigation measures. Then there was that question from you, Member McMillan, to DECA about how the incorporated document would be called up in the scenario that benefits were not achieved as predicted. And we agree with DECA's response that the decision to not require offsets could not be rescinded or reversed. But the response would be through the adaptive management framework, including having regard to monitoring and reporting requirements. And as we've noted above, the incorporated document conditions for native vegetation offsets, they're not relevant to those processes. The conditions requiring implementation of the EMFR. As Ms. Smith submitted, DECA does have comfort that the framework is robust and can enable the monitoring, and we endorse that position as conveyed by Ms. Smith. And insofar as DECA raised the question of availability of environmental water as an uncertainty somehow relevant to the need for these conditions, we invite the committee to proceed in a manner consistent with the previous packages, both insofar that this is a matter that's out of scope and the advice of the VEWH is that sufficient environmental water will be made available. The next topic raised by DECA was seeking a hollow replacement plan, and it based that submission on two species at Gunbow, superb parrot and the carpet python, which it described as hollow dependent species predicted through the AOBI to not have a net gain or be recovered in the first 10 years. Again, we're not seeking to be critical of DECA, but it just does appear that that paragraph is pointing to a misunderstanding of what's presented in the environment report. In this section, we just seek to explain or try and remove the misunderstanding. So the AOBs, they're not an impact assessment. They do not assess the potential impacts of the projects on terrestrial species. And in consultation with DECA on behalf of the Secretary, the AOBs have been designed and prepared specifically to inform whether native vegetation offsets should be required for the projects. The AOBs are therefore focused on lines of evidence of overall benefits to biodiversity through comparative analysis of the response of EBCs and habitats in the maximum inundation extents to the proposed inundation regimes. And whilst the IOBs are appropriate to inform consideration of overall benefits for the purposes of determining whether native vegetation offsets should be required, they're not designed and shouldn't be used for the purposes of assessing potential impacts on the projects on particular threatened species. And to the extent that the AIBs contain assessment of potential impacts on threatened fauna species in a way consistent with DECA's references, such assessments, they just represent a single line of evidence based on modelling and mapping provided by DECA as part of Victoria's native vegetation framework, including through the native vegetation removal tool, habitat importance mapping, and species habitat unit calculations, and which this committee will be aware hasn't been ground truth, such as by way of field surveys undertaken by specialist ecologists. And in the DECA submission, you'll recall that there was a reference to 30 species, and we're understanding that to be drawn from table 37 of the Gunbower AOB. And if I could just have a moment. Mr. Forrest is going to take the mic and the speaker off me and the screen, and then he's just going to walk through this next section with you, with the committee.
All right, thanks.
Thank you, Member McMillan, members of the committee. I'm going to swap the screen sharing over now to the Gunbower AOIB, which of course has been identified and addressed during the hearing. I've started by sharing page 146 of that document, which presents table 37. Table 37 is the table referred to in the submissions that Mr. O'Farrell just took you to, and it presents the comparison of the construction footprint, extent of particular species of flora, and the extent of the modelled existence of that flora within the modelled inundation extent for the project. Without stepping through the table, we identified as addressing a range of species, and by reference to the balance of the work presented in the AOIB, and in particular in Appendix C, which is a native vegetation removal report for this project, the committee will observe that the data underpinning that table and the data which is fed into the figure that I'm now showing on the screen from page 145, figure 45, is data derived from NSIM, the department's environmental systems modelling information by means of the native vegetation removal tool. That is, what's said at table 47 and figure 45 is what the native vegetation removal tool says. So what's presented is purely based on that NSIM information and what it has turned up. We understand the DECA submission to relate to this data because it's the only data that accords with what the DECA submission states in terms of the proposition that species are expected or predicted to experience a net loss or a net loss of habitat with no corresponding net gain. And I've shared figure 45 because it visually illustrates this proposition. And the committee will see on the x-axis potential impact, on the y-axis potential benefit, such that this angled dotted line progressing up the graph indicates the point at which the ratio between benefit and impact is 1, or benefit and impact are equal. Species on the upper side of that line, therefore, are predicted by NSIM and the native vegetation removal tool to experience a benefit, and below the line to experience an impact. And as DECA's identified, there are 30 species which are in this graph and consistent with the table that follows below the line. So for them, this graph says there's a potential impact which is not associated with potential benefit to a comparable extent. The committee will appreciate on review of the AOIBs while we're focusing here on Gunbower, because Deaca's submission relates only to Gunbower as we understand it, the committee will understand that the documents take an approach of a methodology developed in close consultation with the department over a number of years, and which involves a number of lines of evidence, as Mr. O'Farrell's identified. I'm sharing the contents page at page 2 to indicate the lines of evidence which were referred to. Section 3 of the document sets out the methodology, and we commend that to the committee. The committee will observe that one of the lines of evidence relates to native vegetation. Pardon me. Other lines of evidence include consistency of watering regimes with the needs of ecological vegetation classes, having regard to expert elicitation, matters of climate change resilience, the ecosystem function approach, consideration of threatened species in specific terms, and 3.8 native vegetation. The native vegetation section, as I've identified, relates to, in essence, the use of the native vegetation removal tool. The important observation is that, as Mr. O'Farrell's noted, this document is not intended to represent an impact assessment. And insofar as native vegetation, the document presents what it does on the basis of the tool. But if we look elsewhere in the document, we can observe that different information is provided in the context of each line of evidence. And if I consider the assessment of threatened species habitat, for example, that, rather than using the native vegetation removal tool, is supported by habitat importance mapping, also prepared by the department. And when we're thinking in terms of the superb parrot and carpet python, we can refer to it, section 8, which starts at page 110 of the document. And the fact that it establishes for the same species, as shown here in figure 23, significant overall benefit for those species. So the tool's fit for purpose, or the AOIB is fit for purpose for the purpose for which it was developed. It's not an impact assessment and is not intended to serve that purpose. And the submission goes on to address where the impact assessment is contained, but we thought it worthwhile to identify what we understand to be the basis of the DECA identification of potential impact in that context. The final and important thing to note in terms of the net loss, in DECA's words, identified in the native vegetation section in respect of particular species of fauna, is that, as the submissions noted, the presentation of the native vegetation removal tool outputs is not a presentation which is ground truth in and of itself. But when one turns to looking to the ground truthing of those propositions, we've clearly got the specialist assessment, which Mr. O'Farrell will come to in talking through the submission. But the AOIB, shortly after providing table 37, which is the table that we've identified as the source of DECA's position, contains at table 38 a summary of the assessment of likelihood of occurrence of particular species within the construction footprint. And we note there that in and of itself, the AOIB identifies that for the species identified in table 37 as associated with impact and not benefit in a native vegetation sense, those species are then considered for their likelihood of existence, and a number of them are identified as being either not present, unlikely to be present, or potentially present in the context of the construction footprint, such that the ground truthing which follows assists in an understanding that the conclusions in respect of impact and potential benefit are more nuanced or require more consideration than mere reference to the relevant table and graph. I'll hand back to Mr. O'Farrell.
Thank you.
So there at paragraph 93, there's that reference that Mr. Forrester made, that the specialist assessment B and the expert evidence of Mr. Holmes provide the assessment of the effects of terrestrial fauna, and neither conclude that either the superb parrot or the carpet python will be the subject of a net impact. So specialist Appendix 5 to the Special Assessment B presents the assessment of effect pathways for threatened terrestrial species and communities identified as confirmed present or considered possible to be present. But relevantly for gunbow, the superb parrot is identified as present, and it is assessed that with mitigation, impacts during construction are expected to be minor and not ecologically significant, and we've footnoted there where that's found, and that impacts during operation are expected to be very minor and not ecologically significant. Specialist Assessment B illustrates the difference between the identified occurrence of the species in the project areas and the potential impact of the species caused by loss of hollows. And the relevance of hollows to the superb parrot relates to their nesting habitat. The species is not known to breed or nest in the project areas, and no trees identified as containing nesting hollows are proposed to be removed or impacted, such that the potential impact on the species is not due to impacts on hollows, but on foraging habitats. And again, the references are footnoted. In respect to the carpet python, it's identified as having a possible likelihood of occurrence, and it's assessed that with mitigation, impacts during construction are expected to be very minor and not ecologically significant. Impacts during operation have the potential to occur. Most effect pathways are considered to be unlikely or manageable with mitigation. If they do occur, they're expected to be very minor and not ecologically significant. These species persist in a landscape prone to occasional flooding, so impacts from inundation are expected to be within the realms of normal and not cause ecologically significant adverse effects. These species are considered more likely to benefit from inundation, and the risk of death or injury from collisions with vehicles would need to be mitigated if roads are widened or improved. Special Assessment B identifies that python use tree hollows as one of a range of potential shelters, noting it uses hollow trunks and limbs. This uses burrows, caves, rock crevices, and under boulders, and concludes that the species is generally sparse, therefore uncommon, unlikely that individuals would be present at any site when construction activities occur. However, their presence is possible. Construction areas will need to be checked, particularly hollows in trees or limbs to be removed, and animals moved before construction activities commence. As Mr. Holmes noted in his evidence, the EDS include appropriate requirements to avoid and minimise potential impacts on species which use hollows. And on day 8 of the hearing, you heard us seek to clarify the basis on which DECA submits that a hollow plan was warranted. And we understood DECA's response to be that such a requirement is warranted by reference to the carpet python and superb parrot, although there may need to be some need for a response in respect to other species that have not been identified in the environment report or otherwise. We sort of thought, well, that is all a bit inadequate and open-ended. It pointed initially to the carpet python and superb parrot, but when pressed on this, it became apparent that it was really just they would be targeted, but any other species as well would really form part of the DECA response if we understood the DECA response properly. But our submission is that it's just no warrant to include this. There's no evidence base that's been put forward for it. You've got evidence from Mr. Holmes at 97 that a hollow replacement plan was not warranted, having regard to the potential impacts on the particular species considered in the environment report. We did note that DECA didn't question Mr. Holmes, and we noted yesterday that it was stated that DECA was there for the evidence, but made a choice not to ask any questions. But also that we submit that DECA hasn't identified any basis on which his evidence could be or is challenged. And on the basis that DECA made submissions yesterday regarding those species without relevant propositions being put to Mr. Holmes, we asked Mr. Holmes to consider what was being put, and respond to the specific justification identified by DECA, and then we've set out what his response is there. But in summary, it leads to that same conclusion at 98, that put simply, there's no evidentiary basis to require a hollow replacement plan for the 2 species identified by DECA or otherwise. And the or otherwise is a reference to the unspecified, unlimited list of other potential species that, as we understood the DECA submission, it would be looking for in a hollow replacement plan. And there isn't it. Sorry?
Mr. Can I just check that response that you've included at paragraph 97? Was that in his evidence, or you're just saying that was a follow-up question that you, after DECA made their submission? Is that
the latter? So it's
the latter. Yeah. Okay. No, that just so I understand. Yeah.
This is from Mr. Holmes yesterday. I think it was yesterday.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that's fine.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Right. We're a bit conscious of the circumstances of it all, but in a sense, because Mr. Holmes wasn't asked questions on this, had he been asked these questions, he could have given you this evidence. And so we thought that it appropriate to go to Mr. Holmes just so we can furnish the committee with what he would have said had he been asked these questions when he was giving evidence. But we're not going to stand on ceremony and say, well, you just shouldn't entertain DECA's submission because they didn't put these submissions. It wasn't fair that they turned up yesterday making these submissions, having chosen not to ask the questions. But in any event, we trust the committee will be assisted by all that material. At 98, we do say that there is an evidentiary basis, though, to conclude that a hollow replacement plan may do more harm than good. And you've got that from Mr. Holmes. And we submit that you should not be persuaded by DECA's submission that Mr. Holmes' evidence regarding the ineffectiveness of hollow replacement is cause to invoke the precautionary principle. We think that was in that nature of a reach that goes too far. And the approach to requiring mitigation measures is necessarily project specific and must be informed by the evidence of potential environmental effects that have been assessed. And in that respect, the projects and the potential environmental effects are different and distinct from the previous packages, and the evidence of Mr. Holmes is clear. And we also note that it appeared to be an invitation to the committee in the DECA submission to say, well, the hollow replacement plan was somewhere else, so that's a good reason why it should be here. But we ask you to reject that. It should be project-specific assessments and project-specific regulation and monitoring regimes. But for this one, we submit, I'm sure you're clear on what we submit. So at 102, DECA's position appears to extend beyond seeking hollow replacement for the superb parrot and the carpet python. I think we've probably addressed that. But we maintain there's no basis for any requirement for hollow replacement as part of either project, and such an approach has the potential to result in adverse outcomes along the way. I've forgotten the name of the person that said it yesterday, but it was correctly observed that there's thousands of hollows, and I think the submitter was saying within one tree there's thousands of hollows. But do the maths of that across this vast forested area. This is certainly not an area where someone can say there's a scarcity of hollows. If it was a much smaller footprint or forest that we're talking about, or project area where there's very little hollows extant at the moment, maybe be a different consideration, but there's just a forest full of them and a giant forest full of them. So we just submit that on top of everything else is a reason why there's no need for it. Turning into pest and weed management, you had the DECA submission that for gunbower, 30 species predicted to not necessarily have a net gain at a species level from within the first 10 years. And in that context, DECA seeks to amend EDS E3 so that pest and weed management is directed to threatened species predicted to have species-specific net loss, and again, that appears to be based only on that reference in table 37 of the AOBs and that exercise that Mr. Forrest is taking you through. DCARE's position, we'd say, doesn't acknowledge the likelihood of occurrence analysis that was informed by actual field surveys and targeted surveys undertaken by R8, nor is that position informed by the actual impact assessment presented by the relevant specialist assessments. None of the experts called by us recommended an amendment to EDS E3, and that's not a matter that was put to any of the experts. And further, it's not clear whether DCARE's recommended approach of seeking to target pest and weed management at particular threatened species is even capable of being practically implemented in the context of the floodplain environments. So we submit no changes required because that E3 appropriately addresses pests, plants and animals in a sense which is intentionally applicable across the whole floodplain. The fire access road plan, this topic here, we're conscious that DCARE has a broad umbrella for the what roles it's serving. One of it is providing a fire service. The simple point here is that our client's position is that it shouldn't be should have a development contribution imposed upon it just because it's doing works in a particular area which has got fire tracks. Sure, if they break it, they should fix it. Or if there's an access track that requires some gravel thrown on it to ensure that access is preserved, sure, that's fair enough. But it shouldn't be an exercise of because they're doing work in the area, upgrading fire access roads that falls fairly and squarely under DCARE's fire regime and framework. It's got its own separate funding regime for that role and function, and it's not something that this project should be funding. So that's really the gut point, but just to work back through it, DCARE sought requirements for a fire access road plan or something equivalent to that effect, and in response to questions for clarification, DCARE confirmed that it's not seeking upgrades to tracks that are not directly impacted by the Victorian Murray floodplain restoration works. So even in the language that's used there, it's a little bit, I was going to say crafty, but crafty is probably not the right word. It's a little bit evasive of the actual question, but our position is that there is no basis either in the environment work report, evidence or submissions for upgrades to tracks to be undertaken as part of the project for the purposes of addressing fire risk or providing fire access. The proposed approach to dealing with access tracks as part of the projects is something that has been very carefully considered in an effort to utilise the existing track network and avoid and minimise environmental effects to the maximum extent. The work to the access tracks that are proposed are detailed in the environment report based on access track classifications that form part of the respective project descriptions in chapter 6 of the report and presented in the map books. In the absence of any need for access track upgrades caused or contributed to by the projects, it would be inappropriate in our submission for project documentation to require upgrades. And aside from it kind of being like in the nature of a development contribution or a opportunistic loading into the project, which we'd say is just not justified, it could give rise to a situation in which an upgrade wholly unconnected with and not assessed as part of the project could require the clearing of vegetation beyond that necessary for the purpose of the projects. And of course, we'd say that would be the first outcome. So, just by way of an example, particular access track, if it's been suggested that it needs to be widened or upgraded or some particular turning circle needs to come in because there's an existing issue with that particular location, it shouldn't be this project that is called upon to fix an existing problem, because that could lead to, at that particular location, trees having to be taken out to deal with that existing fire access issue at the expense of the trees. So we'd say those sorts of issues should stay in DECA's ongoing fire responsibility, function and budgeting, should be loaded into this project. And at 115, DECA has not identified any track which is not satisfactory in its existing conditions. The projects involve either maintenance of existing tracks or their upgrade. Access tracks must be shown in development plans that are approved by the Minister under the incorporated document, and we submit that provides sufficient certainty as to appropriate outcomes. And then there's also some changes to the EMF that was sought by DECA that's been accepted by our client, and they're reflected in the final day documentation, which we'll come to soon. Dr. Kelly didn't seek to engage with or make submissions in respect to the environment report or the projects respectfully in any material way. Those submissions did not reveal that she'd read the environment report or would assist in an understanding of, as would assist in an understanding of what is proposed and why. For example, she referred to the projects as representing a cookie cutter approach, yet the environment report, evidence and information the committee has received explain the extent and detail of the site-specific design processes that have been carried out. She asked with withdrawal of the projects from SIDLAM, supply measures, why we're even doing this. The ER and evidence established unequivocally that the floodplains are in a state of ecological decline and interventions needed to provide water. She suggested that the barriers, big levee banks being built, etc., none of that is consistent with the environment report or the evidence. She referred in negative terms to the environment report on the basis that floods have happened, species have since been listed, given by way of example the pink cockatoo. The environment report and the evidence proceed on the basis of the best available information that was explained in the evidence. The environment report does acknowledge and assess species that have been subsequently listed, including the pink or major Mitchell's cockatoo, in accordance with the requirements of the SIAC. They are not specifically listed as matters of national environmental significance by reason of their listing after referral of the actions under the EPBC Act. Dr. Kelly otherwise submitted that certain species that are listed there, they need it intact, they need it functioning, they need the cues that come from overbank events, the gentle trickling in of the water. They don't need regulators and pumps and the falseness that is these projects. And it is important to support migratory species, each of which the relevant experts identify as benefiting from the projects. And we reject the assertions that were made in respect of consultation. The submission from Mr. Black, he didn't make an oral submission. We've reviewed the written submission. We note that he described the projects as being part of a program of rejuvenation of all lands for all peoples. He explains that Indigenous plants and flora and fauna, it all revolves around floodplains and re-establishing creeks. And he recalls that as we left town on both sides of the road, the flora was dry and covered in dead grass. As we entered the area that this program was a success. The area where the program was, you could see green grasses and little tree saplings up ahead. By seeing the results, I know together we can revive Indigenous flora and fauna that we thought were lost to all the different areas on the floodplain. Then the next part of the submission, I trust you're happy for me to keep going, Member McMillan.
Yes, I was just checking. Yeah, I assume you've got about 15 minutes to go, or is that?
If that.
Okay, yeah, no, that's fine. Keep going.
One of the questions, inquiries was lessons learned from ES Central and ER Central. We've set out a few in some of the other materials. There's just a couple other things we wanted to point to. We noted that the inclusion of a condition requiring a fire access road plan in the previous incorporated documents has given rise to issues associated with the need for LNW to justify and demonstrate why certain fire access upgrades and design standards cannot be achieved without the potential for clearing of more native vegetation than was assessed and potential impacts on Aboriginal cultural heritage. And this has resulted in additional delay and expenditure of resources without any benefit. And you can see that that's aligned with the submissions we made earlier. And that
sorry, I think Ms. Kelly, Dr. Kelly has her microphone on. Thanks.
It's very tempting to not say that you didn't read the material when you did.
Dr. Kelly, this is not an opportunity for submission. So yeah, this is just the closing.
Right.
Okay, keep going, Mr. O'Farrell.
And look, just since we've had that interruption, if Dr. Kelly did read the materials, well, that wasn't conveyed yesterday, but if she's now conveying to the committee that she has read that, then that's understood. But we maintain the submissions that we've made in terms of if that material was read, how it was interpreted, and how the submissions were put, and what our response is. So if Dr. Kelly's concerned that we're conveying that she hadn't read the materials, we'll withdraw that. There's no need for us to press that. So then lessons learned. Oh yeah, so that 131A, it's kind of, that lessons learned is really part of the reason why we are, can use the expression, digging in on this plea from DECA for the fire access road plan conditions. It's one of these ones that we'd say just goes beyond the scope of the project. It goes into a, without being trying to be critical, it's opportunistic. We'd submit by trying to extract from the project roadworks, fire roadworks that are just part of DECA's ongoing function in these forests that should not be loaded into the project. So that's why we point to that as one of the learnings, because it's proven on the other projects that it's a difficulty that's resulted in delay and expenditure of resources in a way that we'd say doesn't have benefit. And then also the importance of ensuring that the EMF allows for adaptive management, including through appropriate updates of and changes to documents. Then in terms of questions on notice from day 8, you asked Member McMillan about the extent to which the EMF and the ES reflect the current legislative requirements for the environmental watering framework and how this relates to the conclusions of the expert witnesses. Our response is that the existing environmental watering processes are presented schematically in figure 6.3 and described in table 16.6 of the EMF. We could show you those, but we presume that you're familiar with those. So in the interest of time, we won't go to the document. These sections highlight that adaptive management based on a range of factors is central to environmental watering in Victoria. This requires numerous complementary considerations, including utilisation of best available knowledge and understanding of current conditions, which can only be obtained through monitoring. The process, which sits within the broader environmental watering framework alongside the suite of relevant documentation, included among those listed in those EMF 3 and described elsewhere in the EMF, has ministerial oversight with the Minister for Water responsible for overseeing Victoria's environmental water management policy framework and its implementation. The framework cannot be appropriately implemented if monitoring of positive and adverse effects is not undertaken, and this would be evident to the Minister for Water. The EMF otherwise acknowledges and identifies relationships between the projects and relevant documents required by environmental watering framework, providing as appropriate for matters which are to be addressed in those documents as relevant to the projects, while respecting and not duplicating requirements of the existing framework for the development and implementation. In addition, condition 4.7.1 of the proposed ID requires a report to be provided to the Secretary, which provides the monitoring results with respect to overall improvement to biodiversity and also any unintentional impacts. This report cannot be prepared without undertaking monitoring, and therefore there is statutory obligation to ensure that appropriate monitoring is being undertaken. We also point to the following approval of the EMF by the Minister in accordance with condition 4.5. The EMF becomes enforceable under the relevant planning schemes and the Act more broadly. This would include the operational performance management matters described in section 16.8.4 and would require periodic updating in line with any future evolution of the Victorian Environmental Water Framework. The expert witnesses each gave evidence on the basis of the proposed project documentation rather than any separate or independent obligation arising under legislation relevant to environmental watering. In terms of IEA during construction, in the context of submissions, that it is not appropriate to require an independent environmental order in respect of the operation phase, including because of the existing environmental watering framework. You asked whether the position under the existing framework was also relevant to construction. In short, the existing framework primarily concerns operation and does not provide the same surety regarding monitoring, evaluation and reporting or achievement of benefits. And so accordingly, we consider it's appropriate for an IEA to be required for the construction phase. There's a question about the scope of EPBC considerations, and we'd submit that your scope relevant to EPC Act is limited to Victorian matters and matters of national environmental significance listed at the time of project referral. The status of access tracks, there's the question there from the tests, and I think you've had that response on that, and that other tracks identified as new in the environment report and specialist assessment M are in the same location as existing tracks, but would be located atop a containment bank. EDS EMF2, you asked whether that should include the words and any sub-plans for clarity, and we'll address you shortly on that in the final day. And in fact, now might be a good time to go to the final day. Mr. Forrester, if you could assist with that, just to perhaps share to the screen the final version incorporated document. And scrolling through that, we've used the markup tool to identify where there are any changes. And 4.6 is the first one. On the right-hand side, there's a column which says LNW comments, and it says that that's removed consistent with the note in the exhibited version on the basis that, I trust you're familiar with that.
Yeah, can I just clarify, the markup is relative to the day one documents?
Correct.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
So, and then further down, 4.9.2, we've taken that out to improve drafting in response to the matter as it was raised from the committee. And I think I said this the other day, if I didn't, that there's no statutory framework sitting around how it would seek the views, and so that's a bit problematic. There's nothing to stop whoever the relevant authority is from seeking the views of whoever the relevant council or other authority is, but it's best not written into a statutory document like this. So that's why we've suggested that's a useful enhancement to get rid of that. So that's all there is in the incorporated document. Next, in the final version, EMF, we've identified, again, in the same way, I think this is relative to day one. And at 4.1, there's a reference which is a response to the DECA submission. And then 4C, this is another subplans would be approved by Lower Murray Water. And we understand that is consistent with how DECA has put its submission. So we think that what's recorded in 4A through to C accurately records how DECA want to be involved. And then the next document is the final version EDS, again relative to the day one. And EMF2's got a change to that which is really just picking up on the DECA submission.
Mhm.
I think that's the only change in that document.
Okay.
And so that would then take us to the conclusion, which says what you might expect it to say. But if there's any matters we can assist the committee with, happy to try and do that now. If there's anything else you wanted to send us away to have a look at.
I'll just check. Member Elliott, did you have any questions coming out of that closing submission?
No, that was clear on the EMF as well, so thank you.
Right, thank you. And I'll just check with Member Bates if there was any questions.
No, I have no questions.
Thank you. All right, I didn't have any questions either. So thank you for running through that today. Sorry, as I said before, I'm just looking over here because I'm reading notes from a different screen. So the steps from here, so we do have directions where parties will have an opportunity to comment on the proponent's final day documentation just in relation to drafting matters. The PPV office will send out an email as well confirming all of this, but in summary, parties will have 5 business days from today to comment on the final day documents that the proponent has circulated today. I think that will take us up to the 16th of July. Just a reminder that this is not an opportunity to reiterate or restate or make new submissions. This is just about drafting comments, and if you have particular comments on the drafting, and yeah, focusing in on that, we don't want to receive material about additional matters. And also, even if your primary position as a submitter was that the project shouldn't go ahead, these are just comments, you know, in case the committee recommends support or the minister. After that drafting process, the committee has 40 business days to report our findings to the minister. So we'll also confirm that in writing in terms of that process. But I think Mr. O'Farrell also summarised it in some of the closing submissions. The next step is that this committee needs to prepare a report in accordance with its terms of reference. That report will be provided to the Minister for Planning in their capacity under the Environment Effects Act, and then they will complete an assessment that will then be handed on to other decision makers who are the statutory decision makers. So that's the next steps from here. We will put that all into an email. So if anyone has any questions, that should be all covered off in the email. And just to reiterate, we don't want to receive any additional material after today. But we also want to thank everyone who's been involved in the process for the submissions. I know there's been a lot of community submitters who've made themselves available and also come along to the site visit. So we appreciate the effort that everyone's put in. And we also want to extend a special thanks to the proponent and the CMA who also helped coordinate the site visits, and the traditional owners who came out and assisted us on site. And finally, last but not least, I'd like to thank the other committee members and also the project team, including Ms. Selvaraj and Chris Brennan, who's been filling in as well. I can just see a hand raised from Dr. Kelly. Do you have a question?
Could you just clarify, is it an ER or an EES?
It's an environment report.
Just some people were calling it an EES, so
okay, yeah, no,
it seemed like an EES, then it's legalisticness.
Yeah, this is not an opportunity to make submissions about the actual documentation, but just to clarify, it's an environment report that's been prepared under the Environment Effects Act.
Thank you.
No worries. Okay.
And Macmillan, just with that 5 days on the drafting exercise, could I request that the committee just give us 2 days after that? It's unlikely that we would have anything more to say, but just in case something comes up, could you give us 2 days off the back of that to respond to the committee only by way of reply? It's probably unlikely that we'd have anything to say, but just in case.
I think that's okay. Obviously, I can see the other members nodding. Yeah, if anything does pop up in response, I think we can accommodate that. Yeah, and we'll update the little email that goes around to everyone so they have an idea of the timeframes going forward.
Right, and then
Dr. Kelly. Oh,
the only thing I
sorry,
was going to
Mr.
ask Member McMillan was to, on behalf of our client, thank the committee, the PPV staff, the submitters, the traditional owners, and those that have been involved in this hearing in different parts of the state and for a short compass in New South Wales, but to convey our appreciation to all involved in the hearing. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, Dr. Kelly, is your hand still up from the previous question, or is this a new question? I'll assume that's not a new question then. Okay. All right. Well, thanks again, everyone, for your participation. And we will circulate the final copy, final email and draft controls for people to comment on drafting. And I should have said as well, it's not necessary to comment, but if you want to, there's an opportunity to do so. All right. Thank you. We'll just close the hearing now. Thank you very much.